Good morning, everybody, including the honorable judges, my learned advocate friends, and more importantly, my beloved youngsters to whom this webinar is dedicated to. Today, we have one of the popular and coveted name in the history of Supreme Court, a senior advocate, Mr.P.S. Narasimha. He graduated in law from the Delhi University in the year 1988. He has appeared in a large number of cases expanding civil, administrative, contractual, and constitutional matters since 1991. His appearances are reflected in very many landmark judgments of the Supreme Court of India as well as various high courts of the country. The Supreme Court has designated Mr. Narasimha as a senior advocate in the year 2008. After his designation as a senior advocate, he has been assisting the court in a large number of cases involving constitutional interpretation. He has also been a member of various committees, including the Statutory Committee for Legal Aid. Mr. Narasimha was appointed as an amicus curiae in an important case relating to the environmental before the Forest Bench of the Supreme Court, where he assisted the court in developing new concepts and principles of environmental law based on a crucial part of the story and on ancient Indian jurisprudence. Mr. Narasimha was appointed as the Additional Solicitor General of India in the year 2014, and he served in the office till 2018. He represented India before the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea, ITLOS, Hamburg, Germany. He also represented India before the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, ICJ. In the Supreme Court, he has represented the Government of India in a large number of constitutional challenges, including the legality of the Right of Information Act, constitutional validity of criminal defamation, and in the famous case relating to appointment of judges of the Supreme Court and High Courts. He has also assisted the court in the recent landmark judgment on the sensational subject called euthanasia or mercy killing. Mr. Narasimha has recently argued the famous Ram Janmabhoomi on Ayodhya case before the 5 judges bench of the Supreme Court, along with Mr. K. Parasaran, senior advocate, the doyen of the bar. Mr. Narasimha is keenly interested in legal education and is also on the governing boards of some premier law universities. He is also a member of the National Legal Services Authority of India, a statutory authority with an obligation to provide access to justice for all. Mr. Narasimha is a member of the high-powered committee which has recommended sweeping and far-reaching changes in the present arbitration regime. Mr. Narasimha is also associated with Maharashtra National Law University, Nagpur. He is involved in promotion of Indian logic, Dharma Shastras, and other Indic jurisprudence and legal education. And there are many more feathers in the cap. With this warm introduction, on behalf of Lex Webinar Series and my co-host Hemalatha, I wholeheartedly welcome Mr. P.S. Narasimha. Sir, the forum is yours.
Thank you very much, Srinivasan. That was a very long introduction. And I'm very happy to be part of this webinar, which is now a new world order. And I have come to you all to discuss a very important topic. And this topic is of great interest to me too. This will affect the existing way in which the fundamental rights are being adjudicated and defended in courts of law. We will now be dealing with an issue relating to how the civil courts can step in and ensure that the power of the executive could be controlled. The topic is relevant not merely in the context of constitutional law, it will also be important in the context of how the courts are conducted, how lawyers appear before different forums, and what could be the future of such litigation. The basis for this discussion arises from a very fundamental issue, that is the issue relating to power. We are talking of constitutional law and administrative law. The problem with power is that it could be abused in a manner which would cause fear, or it could be abused in a manner which will cause favor to others. So, in order to regulate the power, in the West, they evolved this concept of splitting the power in a manner that the person who is exercising the power is bereft of two very important facets of such power, which will be the power to legislate as well as the power to adjudicate. For today's purpose, we are concerned with the power of the executive and the control of such power in the context of judicial. We should not assume that the power is always being controlled only by the judicial. The one very important restraint on the exercise of the power is by the legislature itself, which makes laws, and it is only in the context of such laws that the power can be exercised. And another facet is also executive in itself, like we have something like a Lokpal, ombudsman. Executive also controls the power. But by and large, the most popular and the most effective is the legislative control, the judicial control of power. Now, in the context of judicial control of power, we are talking of what is this judicial control of power? The Constitution speaks of various forums under which the power is, the judiciary exercises the power. We have under the Constitution Part 5 in Chapter 4, where the Supreme Court under Article 124 to 147 exercises the power. Its establishment and its functioning are prescribed therein under the Constitution. We also have under the Constitution, under Part 6 and Chapter 6, under Articles 124 to 214 to 232, the High Court's jurisdiction and its powers, which takes within its the most popular article, the Article 226. We have also under the Constitution, very importantly about which we are talking today, is the chapters relating to subordinate courts. That is in Part 6 and Chapter 5. And over and above that, we have also Part 14A, under which the tribunals are established. 323A and 323B are the provisions under which the tribunals are established. All these constitutional mechanisms are forums which exercise jurisdiction to regulate the power which is to be exercised by the executive. These are all judicial forums, and all these are constitutional forums. Over and above the constitutional forums, we have also what's called the statutory forums, where in exercise of the legislative power, the parliament as well as the state, drawing out of list 1, 2 and 3, make laws, and under those laws tribunals are established, and those tribunals are also exercising power to control the executive. Now, the question is that after the advent of the Constitution, when we have introduced Part 3 in the Constitution and created fundamental rights, the enforcement of fundamental rights are done primarily by the Supreme Court as well as the High Court. Now, High Court exercises power under 226, Supreme Court under Article 32. One question arises whether the power of the High Court and the Supreme Court put together, do they actually monopolize and concentrate within themselves solitarily the power to control the executive with respect to fundamental rights by issuance of writs as specified in those two articles. So far as enforcement of fundamental rights are concerned, yes, these two articles specifically provide that. But it is not the intention of the constitutional makers that the power must always be concentrated in Supreme Court as well as the High Courts for defending the fundamental rights. Article 32, sub-article 3 enables very clearly that the Parliament can make law. The section says, without prejudice to the powers conferred on the Supreme Court by clauses 1 and 2, Parliament may by law empower other courts to exercise within its local limits, its jurisdiction, all or any of the powers exercised by the Supreme Court under clause 2. So Parliament, its constitution itself enables that the power of writ as contemplated in Article 32 and 226 can actually be given to other courts. Other courts, the constitution is talking about the tribunal as well as the civil courts in particular, about which we are talking about. A law can be made to enable the civil courts to exercise the power of writ. And by such power, the civil courts can defend the fundamental rights of citizens. We must remember that this article is in part 3 and enables the exercise by the other courts, including the civil courts, the power of the Supreme Court, which means that it will be confined only to the fundamental rights, as against the legal right which the Parliament, which the Constitution used exclusively to the High Courts. There is also Article 139, which says that the Parliament can, if it wants, give to the Supreme Court also the same kind of a power which the High Court has exercised with respect to other legal rights. We are not really concerned about all that. Today we will concentrate on seeing whether it is actually the monopoly of the High Courts that we should file writs, and whether it is the monopoly or whether it is become an accepted practice that we all run to the High Court by filing the writ petitions. To make it simple, should this civil courts also not be the forums where we go and file a petition there and then ask for some kind of an order of stay, injunction, or a declaration against the government in the context of its exercise of the power? That, in my view, is a very important aspect which we must reflect upon. Because what we are talking about is remedies. And is the civil court bereft of such exercise? If you look at the way in which we function, if principles are laid down by the Supreme Court and as well as the High Court in judgments which are declaratory in nature, Article 144 says that every forum, executive as well as the judicial forum in the country, shall act in aid of the Supreme Court. So, as judicial forum is also taken into account, the civil courts must abide by the principles and the precedents as laid down by the High Courts and the Supreme Courts. So civil courts are bound by that. and we see every day that they in fact apply the principles. All constitutional principles, either directly under the constitution or implemented through statutes, coupled with the principles laid down by the Supreme Court in its precedents, are in fact applied by civil courts day in and day out. All of us go before the civil court, argue the matter, whatever may be, whether it's a civil or a criminal case, refer to the principle and then apply it. 144 is in fact a provision which says that you must do it as an obligation to do it. So therefore we have now the Supreme Court and the High Court which lay down the real norm or the principle, and in its day-to-day implementation, it is actually the civil court which applies. This kind of a problem arose even in a new democracy, that is South Africa, where the problem arose because of neglect of the civil courts and focus and concentration on the High Court and Supreme Court for filing writ petitions. So much so that with the advent of the Constitution, the High Courts and 226 jurisdiction has become rather elitistic, and the civil courts have fallen into some kind of a redundancy with respect to enforcement of fundamental rights as well as giving orders and directions in the performance of the duties by the executive. They have said, it's a very interesting passage which I have seen in the, which is relevant for us very much. That is, the quotation is, it is inconceivable that those provisions, that is fundamental rights and other things, which are meant to safeguard the fundamental rights of the citizens, should not be applied in courts where majority of people have their initial and perhaps only contact with the provisions of the Constitution, namely the lower courts. Such an interpretation would frustrate its very purpose of constituting a bridge to a better future. It would negate the principle of accountability or justification in those courts where most of the day-to-day administration of justice takes place. This is exactly the problem that we are facing today. For every small action or inaction on the part of the government, we all rush to the nearest courts. That is perhaps the reason, it just occurs to me, that we are now calling in for creating benches in the different parts of the states. Why is it? Why is it that we need more benches of the high courts in different parts of the state? That is the requirement of the people who are living in faraway places from the high courts, and the accessibility is reduced. And focus is completely on the high courts for getting an order against the government. So obviously anybody coming at the far place has to travel all the way to Chennai or any Mumbai or any place which we can think about in our country. Therefore, the time has come when we will have to think about how can we vest in the civil courts the power and jurisdiction to control the executive power. Most of the writ petitions that are filed in the High Court, you know, that arising because at least in the southern courts, there is a method by which the cause list is prepared, under which we would see that which writ arising out of which district of the state. So if we see like that, as many as the 13 districts of Madurai, for example, because we are talking about the Madurai branch, 13 districts commencing from Kanyakumari, Tenni, Tirunelveli and so on, all of them will have to come to Madurai. But on simple fact that before doing a particular act, the collector or the authority did not give a notice, or a simple fact that he should have actually given me a hearing. If these things are not followed, we rush to the High Court. In the High Court, file a writ petition, High Court passes an order. In extradition, there is a fundamental principle which became very important for international arguments in matters of extradition, a crime has to be investigated, tried, and a punishment be imposed at a place which is closest to the scene of occurrence. That's a principle which should apply to us also. Wherever there is a violation of law, wherever there is an illegality, that illegality must be corrected at a place which is closest to the place of its occurrence. This is the principle on the basis of which one would say that there must be a situation where the restitution must be closest to the place of its occurrence. What was the position? The second question is, what was the position which occurred before the constitution came into force? I have generally been saying cases arising from 1856, 1857, 1906 onwards, there are much more. There are a large number of judgments of the civil courts during the British time where they have actually interfered with the exercise of power by the executive. That is either in the initial period against the East India Company's exercise of power, or subsequently when the Crown took over in 1857. There are series of judgments where the civil courts have interfered and exercised the power of restraining the executive. The question which immediately will arise is, why is it that we are unable to do after the advent of the Constitution? This is a factor which we must see, we must look into it. And why have we relegated our civil courts to courts where only matters relating to disputes inter se between individuals are being adjudicated? With the advent of the Constitution, the constitutional debates also talk about a situation where we have for the first time introduced subordinate judiciary as a deviation from 1935 Government of India Act, and wanted to create independence of judiciary. And after the Constitution, the efforts made by the Supreme Court were substantial. So far as subordinate judiciary is concerned, the Supreme Court's entire focus was on ensuring that the civil courts must be independent of the executive. So the focus so much was on independence of judiciary, is the subordinate judiciary, rather than ensuring that its scope, ambit, and jurisdiction is expanded and enable people to approach it at the first instance, even in cases of public law. Now, what are the tools in the hand of the civil court? High Court and Supreme Court are vested with the power of writ directly provided in the Constitution under 226 of 32. A civil court under Section 9 can entertain any matter for that case. So therefore, there is no restriction on that. As against what the position was in England, where because of common law, without a statutory provision, the equity courts, the bifurcation occurred with respect to what could be called as Queen's Courts, public law courts, and private law courts. Public law courts enabled challenge to the validity or of a statute or questioning the exercise of the executive power. And it was not possible to challenge such things before civil courts. So there is a very famous judgment of the House of Lords in O'Reilly versus Macmahon, where a case which was filed in a civil court and a case related to the exercise of power by the executive was set aside on the sole ground that it could not have been filed in the civil court because this is a public law case and you must go only to the High Court, to the Queen's Court, judicial review proceedings. In our country, there is no such distinction because everything is constitutional, statutory in nature. So therefore, if a law enabled filing of a case like Section 9 does, every case could be filed in the civil court. I will be dealing with the exclusion of jurisdiction by the civil courts and also the problems arising out of interpretation of constitutional and statutory validity matters and the scope of the Supreme Court in that context. But for us to start with, Section 9 has no limitation with respect to filing of a case on a matter of principle. It's only an exclusion. So now if civil courts are unlimited in that nature and a suit can be filed, the methodology needs to be worked out. We have also the Specific Relief Act. You are all masters in Specific Relief Act. You know how the scope and ambit of Specific Relief Act could be applied in matters of possession, which arise so many times in the rural India, in the context of government taking over any land or any, which affects agricultural lands too. Specific Relief Act provides specific provisions for that. We are not talking about private realm in the context of contracts. So therefore, specific performance of the contracts is not really relevant for today's discussion, except to say that the principle of promissory estoppel can be brought in there. Specific Relief Act also very clearly speaks about the locus of who could invoke the jurisdiction, which is quite a bit akin to that of the locus that the courts have developed in entertaining a petition under 226 or even 32. In the context of public interest litigation, that becomes very, very relevant. Most significant aspect is with respect to the declaratory reliefs. The declaratory relief contemplated under section 34 and 35, if read and understood very clearly, shows that the scope is so very clear that public law issues can in fact be instituted, invoked and clearly agitated before the civil courts. Because 34 declaratory relief talks about discretion of a court, any person entitled to any legal character. We are talking about a legal character or any right as to any property. Once you show that there is a legal character, then you could always invoke the jurisdiction of a civil court. And the great advantage of invoking the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is, even in a case where there is a probability or there is a semblance of a right, you could ask the civil court to exercise its jurisdiction and grant declaratory relief, which will not be possible so far as the high courts are concerned, exercising power under 226. That's the double advantage of invoking the jurisdiction of the civil court in public law issues. Apart from the declaratory relief, even in cases where uncertain rights are existing, please imagine a case where under Public Premises Act, somebody goes to a high court. High court says, all right, in the exercise of the power, before passing an order, notice issued, not issued, the court could interfere on that, or there is a violation of statutory provision. But in case where the title is a little uncertain, the High Court says hands off. The High Court can't even interfere, can't say anything. He says this needs to be established before a civil court. But whereas in a civil court, there can be a dual capacity of if the civil courts exercise the jurisdiction, it will to start with look at the petition in the context of a judicial review, about which I will just speak in a few minutes later. In the context of stage one, we'll say whether it is a case where the exercise of power is not within the prescribed principles, and stage two it will go and then ask the party to give in evidence to see further whether he has the right title, and then pass an order which will encompass not only the power part of it, but also a declaratory relief. That is the advantage of going to the civil courts in cases of exercise of executive power, challenging the exercise of executive power. We also need to develop principles of entertaining civil suits which are instituted, where the court would exercise judicial review power in matters relating to injunctions also, and preventive relief, which the court can give in temporary and permanent injunction and mandatory injunctions also. All these powers which the civil court can exercise in terms of specific relief act are very, very clearly and closely associated to the principles already developed by public law forums and constitutional courts, and the relief that can be granted will be not in deviance of the public law principles but in consonance with public law principles. So one would have to interpret the specific relief act as well as the inherent powers of the civil court in a manner which over a period of time we must tailor the kind of relief, tailor the kind of prayers that we are going to make before the civil courts in such a manner that the civil courts will be able to exercise that power and grant relief as early as possible and as closest to the place of occurrence. Now, there are problems which have really prevented people from knocking on the doors of the civil court. I'll conclude with this so that we can have a discussion. The problems are multifold. First is there is section 113 of the CPC, which says that the matter has to be referred to the civil court in case there is a dispute with respect to the validity of a statute or an interpretation. 113 is not understood in its proper perspective. All that 113 says is that where a court is satisfied that the case pending before it involves a question as to the validity of an act, ordinance or regulation, or any provision contained in the act, ordinance or regulation of which necessary for the disposal of the case, and its opinion of such act or ordinance is inoperative but has not been so declared by the High Court to which the court is subordinate or by the Supreme Court, the court shall state the case, setting out its opinion and the reasons thereof, and refer the matter. 113 will apply only in cases where you challenge the validity of a statute and that the determination of the validity is absolutely necessary before you proceed further. The second problem which people think is the reason for not knocking on the doors of the civil court is Order 27A. Order 27A again talks about a substantial question of law, and substantial question of law again takes to the constitutional interpretation of the substantial question of law. Here again I want to emphasize that neither in 113 nor in Order 27 we are concerned about the remedies that we are wanting the civil court to grant, that is the remedy of merely interfering with an illegal act of the executive, and we don't need bulk of the matters which go to the High Court. 3/4 of the matters which go to the High Court in the writ petition don't involve the validity of a statute, don't involve the interpretation of a substantial question of law, of constitutional or statutory interpretation. Most of the writ petitions, you all know with your great experience, are writs where an act of the collector or the executive you are alleging is arbitrary, unreasonable, illegal, contrary to law, no opportunity, violative of fundamental rights. These are the points on the basis of which bulk of the matters are filed before the High Courts. So therefore, section 113 or 27A has no problem so far as the civil courts entertaining matters where the executive or the collector or the RDO has passed any order which are contrary to the statutory position. So therefore, there is no need for us to be restrained from knocking the doors of the civil court. The third problem with respect to the civil courts, the first two in my view are assumptions, which is a mental blockade which we must get over. The third relates to section 80. That is, before you institute a suit, you will have to issue notice to the governments. Which problem can be solved with some amendment. In fact, Law Commission has recommended that it should be taken over. In the High Courts also, we have standing counsels to whom we hand over a copy before we file the case before the court. Some kind of a system like that needs to be developed. So section 80 can't be a provision or a statutory law which will prevent people from going to the civil court and asking for relief. In fact, if it is operating as a kind of a impediment, then that should be struck down to that extent as being unconstitutional, because there is clearly no access to justice. But Law Commission has recommended, courts have also exercised that power in cases where the court is of the view that this will cause difficulty and the discretion is vested in such. The fourth part of it is a little more important and a serious problem, that is exclusion of jurisdiction. Now, with large number of statutes covering the field, providing reliefs, providing securities, providing opportunities and rights, all these statutes are invariably hedged with the clause which says that it will exclude the civil court's jurisdiction. This is the major problem with respect to which large number of matters go to the High Court, because the jurisdiction of the High Court under 226 cannot be taken away by statute. As that can't be done by a statute, at least 226 is available, so people go to High Courts challenging a particular matter in the teeth of a statutory provision which also provides that the civil court has excluded jurisdiction. This is a matter of reform, and this is an area which necessarily to be looked into, and that reform of taking away, restoring the civil court with the jurisdiction that it would have, when there is no clear alternative remedy available under the statute, is anyway accepted by the civil court. But we must see a situation where that unnecessarily rushing to the High Court, and this has happened because of complete and total exclusion of the civil court in exercising jurisdiction in case a statute provides a particular methodology and rights and duties. That is a matter which has to be worked on, and it is my view that there must be at least a limited scope for the forums which will look into the matter, and the civil court's power and jurisdiction must slowly and gradually be increased. There are two major reasons why I am saying that. Today we are talking about a situation where high courts are flooded with writs after writs in all matters of this nature. If we conceive of a situation where the high courts and supreme courts will set the norm, set the principle, and leave that norm and principle, including interpretations, to be applied by civil courts in granting relief, it will go a long way in helping our citizens. Today we are now in a situation where we are contemplating, people are suggesting that we must have a forum between the High Court and Supreme Court. Because High Court's Supreme Court is flooded, because Supreme Court is flooded, you will have to have a regular appellate court. If you have a regular appellate court, it will take substantial portion of the appeals from the High Court. Why is that happening? Because high courts are flooded. As high courts are flooded, we are now contemplating in creating an additional forum. I think great amount of relief can be given to the individuals, citizens, as well as to the working of the High Court and the Supreme Courts by enabling the civil courts to expand its jurisdiction, apply the laws, and also allow them to exercise jurisdiction in matters concerning exercise of power by the executive. I think the time has come when we should vest our civil courts. The time has come also to consider our civil judges to be grown-ups, as well somebody said, who are capable or entitled to apply the laws and see to what extent judicial review remedy can be provided to the citizens of the country. This is broadly in the limited time that I have had to tell you that we have unfortunately lost the vigor, breadth, and versatility of civil courts' knowledge and breadth by assuming that high courts are the only courts for exercise of jurisdiction in judicial review matters. The time should come when civil courts should also exercise, and I'm sure the bar, so far as the Mofussil bar is concerned, will also develop and rise to the occasion and make our civil courts the vibrant courts where the people are closest to it. With this, I return to you, Srinivasan.
Thank you, sir. The first question is, they want to know whether you advise or suggest divesting of the writ juris of the High Court by conferring the power of High Courts to issue writ of mandamus to district courts.
Yeah, my answers are twofold. First is, it is not a suggestion to divest the High Court, not a suggestion to divest the High Court's powers. It is not possible also, should not be done also. Secondly, that the problem is with the assumption that the civil court does not have such jurisdiction. That is what I was emphasizing in my earlier speech. I was saying that the directions akin to the writ of mandamus, can actually be issued in by virtue of the provisions under the Specific Relief Act, 36 to 42 onwards.
Yes.
So under those provisions, mandatory injunction can be granted, which means that there is an obligation on the government and you have a right. Right is defined, obligation is defined under the Specific Relief Act. If you have a look at the definition of obligation, and obligation very clearly says that some kind of a claim that you have, if you have that, then you can ask for a mandatory injunction. You can tell the collector to do it. So therefore, it is akin to the relief that you're going to get in a mandamus. So you should utilize it.
Yes, sir. So next question they ask is, in case of any amendment required to give the power of judicial review to the civil courts, what would be the nature of amendment you may suggest?
Amendments in the sense that for exercise of judicial review, there is no need for any amendments. We are talking about control of the executive action. What is judicial review? Judicial review is the exercise of control, judicial control over executive action. You don't need, in fact, the civil courts are constitutional courts. I told you that civil courts are constitutional courts because they are established by the Constitution, Part 6, Chapter 5, 233 to 237. 237. So if they are constitutional courts, then they will exercise jurisdiction. If they exercise the jurisdiction, then they must also have jurisdiction over the executive for an illegal exercise of the power. So only difficulty is that you cannot set aside a statute as unconstitutional and you cannot interpret the Constitution. we are not concerned about that in our day-to-day matters. We are concerned about the executive action. And thirdly, the problem arising because in case of exclusion of the jurisdiction. If the civil court's jurisdiction is excluded, take for example, Consumer Protection Act. If the civil court's jurisdiction is completely excluded, civil courts can't interfere. Like that, there are a very number of forums where the civil court's jurisdiction are excluded. If there is no exclusion, the jurisdiction vests.
Yes.
Vests completely.
And the next question is not directly relating to what you deliberated. This person has asked a question, why not the principal court of original jurisdiction exercise a revisional jurisdiction against the order of the municipal court and subcourt? Why should for a revision, we should go to the high court from the orders of the municipal court and subcourt? I think they mean under section 115 CPC. Instead of going to, because for first appeal, they go to only the district court.
Correct.
Why should for a revision against the order of the interlocutory application, we should go to the high court?
See, it depends upon the forum. See, it all starts about where the court case originates.
Yes,
if
sir.
the case originates before the district court, the appeal can only be the high court. If the case originates in the civil court, there must be one appeal. You can't just straight away go to the Supreme Court or to the high court.
High court.
So therefore, it's a status and a forum. That's a civil. Those are matters relating to how do you formulate, how do you provide a appellate jurisdictions, which should be the appellate jurisdiction, which is higher and also capable of correcting the errors. So that's a matter of policy, I should say, to put it in the simple judicial. It's a policy of creation of an appellate forum.
So one question from Mr. Ilangovan, A. Ilangovan says that what kind of steps should be taken to avoid that by way of new statutes and establishment, new forum to take away the essence of common civil law?
So that's the policy. My friend is very right. Ilangovan is very right in raising that question. That is the matter of, instead of strengthening the civil court to handle new kind of problems for which you are creating new statutes, you are saying that I will take away from the civil court and create a new forum. That's the continuous problem that is going on. You weaning away step by step the jurisdiction of the civil court. Instead, the methodology could be that strengthen the civil court and enable the civil court to come up to the to develop in such a way that it will be able to handle and apply its mind to modern jurisdictions and pass orders. In my view, there is absolutely no problem for the civil courts in doing that, but the contra is happening because the jurisdiction is being taken away, they have no exposure to it. So, but if you are giving the jurisdiction, courts will have the expertise of lawyers who would come and assist the court, introduce new principles, new laws. We see that new concepts coming up every day. With artificial intelligence coming in, now even to the High Courts and Supreme Courts also, a lawyer has to introduce to the judge how artificial intelligence applies and in its application, how it affects the rights and what are the obligations of the state. So therefore, it takes a little time for a judge to understand. Even in telecom matters, that was a time when how spectrum is to be allocated. So if spectrum has to be allocated, so judges are told what is the spectrum is. So everybody learns, because life of a lawyer, life of a judge is a life of learning, and everybody is capable of doing it. And we have the beautiful system of experts coming and then explaining to the lawyers, and lawyers simplifying them and then explaining it to the judges. So therefore, the system is there. We should not be under the assumption that civil courts will not be capable of handling it. But this trust has created a bit of a problem for us.
Yes. So may I now request Justice Vimala of Madras High Court, who has recently retired, to interact with you.
Yes, sir. Good morning to all of you. Your presentation is, there are comments simply elegant, but simply serious. I joined a little bit late, but still I was able to feel and recognize it is elegant, but at the way it conveys very serious issues. I think for the first time, you have touched upon the problems of the civil court, namely the subordinate judiciary. And the way in which you have been expressing your view that it must be believed that the subordinate judiciary judges are also capable. It must receive the attention of all concerned. Definitely, sir. If we recognize, lot of things would be finished off at the subordinate court level itself. No need for them to come to the High Court. Coming to High Court is not a luxury at all. Coming to High Court is not an easy job for an agriculturist in a remote place at all. They have to rely upon the trial court lawyers. They don't have the ability to come directly. Those who are maybe in a highly elevated position, it may be easy for them and not for them. But the one more thing is, they must first of all recognize that those who are elevated from district judiciary in the High Court level at least are capable. A distinction at that level itself, then where is the question of talking about recognizing the subordinate judges of the subordinate judiciary? I think the time that unless we recognize, many of them may not get justice. Very first time your talk, I feel that it is towards moving reforms, where the reform is required, how the reform is required. Excellent presentation, sir. I really congratulate you for your talk. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, madam. Thank you for interaction.
Thank you.
May I request Ms. Mohana of the Supreme Court.
Oh.
Ma'am, Mohana ma'am.
Yes, good morning.
Sir, Narasimha sir, but for Ms. Mohana's intervention, this session is not possible, sir.
I took liberty.
Judicious intervention.
I'm saying what a pleasure.
No, I just took the liberty, Narasimha.
He always scolds me, sir. I don't know what she's going to say now. Tell me.
No, congratulations, Narasimha. That's excellent, and it's a thought-provoking idea that you have thrown. I must say that it is actually needed, and it's which is much needed today. And anyway, like you said, we have situations like intellectual property and big matters like telecom matters and other things which anybody can handle. If they can handle, the judges can handle such subjects. They can very well handle all those disputes, like an executive orders being illegal or arbitrary or anything. And there's nothing that bars them also to deal with this situation, except that we need more courts and more equipments. That's it, and infrastructure to be created. So it's very, very thought-provoking. And like Justice Vimala said, it is something which requires a lot of attention. Very nice. And I'm also benefited by listening to your lecture, Narasimha. That's also a selfish motive of recommending your name for this.
No, I want to share with you.
Yeah.
It so happened, my father practiced in Chennai for a while before the bifurcation took place and Andhra formation, and then my father shifted to Guntur first and thereafter to Hyderabad. So in '83, he had written an article on this.
Okay.
And somehow I happened to see it about 10 years back. And the thought was in my mind as to why is it that we are neglecting our civil courts? And if we strengthen the bottom, you know what's happening is that we are not strengthening the bottom, we are strengthening somewhere in the middle.
Correct.
That is in the High Court. And then again, that pressure of the High Courts is falling on the Supreme Court.
Yeah. And
so every writ which is decided in the High Court has to go to the Supreme Court only.
Yeah, there's no other.
So why is it that simple cases of non-issuance of notice before an order is passed by the collector, all sorts of simplest matters,
correct,
people has to rush in and imagine why is it that somebody at a far-flung place has to run all the way to the High Court?
Correct.
And we have capable district bars. Just imagine the district bars like Visakhapatnam or Coimbatore. Or your bars are excellent district bars. Yeah. You have top lawyers in the district courts.
Correct.
Excellent lawyers. In their depth in civil law is phenomenal. And anybody who knows civil law or even very well criminal law is automatically a constitutional lawyer. So therefore, we are not talking of first-time interpretations. Yeah. We are talking about implementation and enforcements. For that, I think we have enough intellect and enough base in our civil courts.
Yeah, that's very true. And I'm sure, therefore, many a times the cases don't receive the attention in High Court that it should not normally would receive. If it had gone to the civil court, probably it would have been, the more nuances could have been explained there and we would have got better orders there. Sometimes we tend to think. So it's always a better concern, even for the client and for the lawyers and for the system. I think it's better that we seriously think about this suggestion.
Yeah, what could be done is that what happens in implementation of reforms is you apply a reform across the board. So when you speak of everybody, you speak of none. But if you experiment it, take for example, some proactive Chief Justice with his colleagues must experiment it in one district. Train the lawyers. They draft a plaint in such a manner that it is in two parts. First part relates to judicial review part. Second part relates to the regular prayer of right. So therefore, you could get relief in a short period in the first part itself.
Yeah.
So judges should also be trained with respect to indicated about how you apply judicial law, because you are not concerned with the decision-making process, decision itself.
Correct.
You are concerned only with the decision-making process.
Yes.
You cannot interfere with the decision. It is the procedure, it's the manner. Those are relevant rather than the right itself. So
Once
they'll pick up like anything. There's no issue.
Yeah. Once it is opened up, and we have academies giving them training periodically, I'm definitely sure that this will.
Like the way we are opened up our hearings on the web.
We'll see.
Can you imagine now? Can you imagine? I was speaking to our friends in the Punjab and Haryana bar. I said it's only your thinking, because technology takes you over. You don't even realize. We know the times when we used to put manually type on our computer.
And stencil.
We know the time when our cause list used to come in printed form.
Yes.
Today we don't have cause list being printed.
Yes.
It just comes through the net.
Correct.
We are all part of this change.
Yeah.
And today, just imagine how many people Srinivasan has connected through this webinar, sitting at different places.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I was before the Supreme Court where Hari Salve appeared along with me, sitting in London. Just imagine. And somebody from some of the senior counsel was in Madhya Pradesh. So he just joined the hearing. So technology will add to the wealth. It doesn't take away.
Change is the only constant factor.
Yes, Srinivasan.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chitra Sampath, ma'am.
It's a new concept which you have proposed now. And two things which perturbs my mind is that you want to retain the power of the High Court on this aspect, but also give it concurrently on the lower courts. Will not the High Court wash away saying you've got alternative remedy, go to the lower courts?
Don't you know, we have the similar situation of 226 and 32, right?
Correct. But in 226, mostly we face only against the state. Not 227, we go for the
right. You are right, but then we can't take away the High Court. See, choice, I put it like this. What is wrong in providing a citizen with the choice?
Point which disturbs me is, we are trying to enforce our fundamental right to a hearing. See, the main point which you are saying is where there has been obviously lack of notice and the failure to hear, all that need not come to High Court. It can be decided in the lower courts. Can we be selective about the case that can be filed in the lower forums and what can be filed in the High Court? Can such a dichotomy be brought in?
I think over a period of time, I think we are all in the realm of how to develop and provide to our citizens, ourselves, better forums, right? So we are thinking aloud. See, as this problem arose in South Africa, where they have said that wherever norm is to be set, wherever an interpretation is to be given, wherever a principle has to be developed for the first time, in all such cases, they have said the courts such as the high courts and the Supreme Courts are, like for example, sexual orientation. Those principles are developed at the highest forum. But if an executive violates a right and it is contrary to an existing high court's judgment, you don't need to run back to the high court for that. It is simply a case where the district judge will say, it's already, Supreme Court has already, High Court has already held that this section has to be read along with the principle of natural justice in which notice is to be issued. So then he will, at the nearest place, he would say that you must issue order. Yes, I agree with you that the chance is there, but over a period, I think the jurisdictions will settle down as to in which matters the High Court. I think the principle should be, to start with, I must agree with you, High Courts can't say, don't come to me. High Court can't say. But
one more doubt I have is,
but I think this will get settled by the practice of the individuals. If an individual would go to the district and say, sir, this is what has happened, and he files a case and gets him relief, and this happens more often, then I think things will answer. That will answer.
One aspect what you touched is about Section 80. There is a provision in Section 80 for an emergent suit even before notice. So that is not an issue. But now most of the subordinate judiciary are thinking they are all government servants.
Yes. Okay.
So will we get relief against the government? See, except the High Court judges, because they treat themselves as constitutional heads, their constitutional post they are holding. All subordinate judiciary are treating themselves as government servants. They have their PF and gratuity, everything to be settled. Will they be in a position to pass an unbiased order against the government or the local collector? That will be a big issue for us.
Ma'am, I have two views. You also know that it's not confined to civil courts. That attitude and then that approach is not confined. No court is ever free from a criticism of that nature. But I think if there is such a problem in the civil courts, then the first answer is to rectify that rather than to say that you shall not exercise jurisdiction.
Yes. No, what I'm saying, which is what we are discussing a topic is at a very nascent stage. We'll have to think all these aspects also when we are going to go down that lane. That's what I'm only saying.
I agree with you. I agree.
And one, to say it in a humorous way, we lawyers, we always like to come to the High Court rather than go to the lower courts. So though we have an alternative remedy, we still draft the writ petition in such a way that alternative remedy need not be exercised. When we are given this option of going to both, the lawyer will say, no, you'll get relief only in the High Court. Even now, as a civil lawyer, if I want any injunction, I'll try to hike the fee and file it in the High Court and get an order rather than go before the civil courts. That's the trend, no?
I agree with you, but I am thinking that with deeper thinking, people will realize that life in districts will be far better, and confining to the districts is better. So over a period of time, I think better forums to practice and stay there.
And last but not the least, when the order is passed by the High Court itself, the executive is not respecting it. Therefore, we are flooded with contempt petitions. How we are going to execute an order by a lower forum? That's going to be tough, because in spite of issue of contempt petition having been filed, no notice of 21 days rule is also been issued. In spite of it, there's absolute disobedience and disregard of the order. We are not in a position to enforce any order against the executive even before the High Court. How are we going to do it before the trial? That's going to be tough. That's be tough. These are all only points
what you're saying, ma'am, what you're saying is a very valid point, because when we are talking about the judicial review, which is resorted by everybody, and let us talk only of the High Courts under the Chapter 6, in which case it has, the High Courts have the power of contempt too and would exercise in jurisdiction. But then not in every case goes to contempt. In cases of implementation, of the order, if it is not complied, if a district court's order is not complied, invariably it so happens that one would have carried the matter, the government would have carried the matter to the High Court would have dismissed it. Nevertheless, he would not implement it. In such cases, the High Court would have exercised the jurisdiction. So therefore, the remedy of an individual is not taken away. Yes, that's an issue, but then it need not bother us in the sense of because tomorrow I can't get a contempt notice against the government, so I will not go to the civil court. That situation need not bother us. You have taken up a very important point. I'll give a thought to it, how to enforce it. But then contempt power is there for the civil courts also.
Also, they have also.
Anyway. But I'm saying, what my friend is saying is that doesn't care about district judges in contempt. But it all depends upon the judge and how he.
And Madam Justice Vimala has raised an objection that I have said that subordinate courts are treating themselves as servants of government because they are not in a position to pass an order against the government because all their infrastructure, everything is much dependent on the executive. I feel that there may be a bias or maybe they may not be free in mind to pass any order like that. Not every, I'm not talking about every judge, but I'm saying that there is a possibility.
All of us in our country, we suffer from an attitudinal problem because the approach that we have towards district and official courts is not of recent origin. Because under the Crown Act, during the time of British, when the forums were established, Mayor's Court, thereafter the Supreme Court, and again the High Court, these were all very elitistic courts which were intended to serve the British. Whereas so far as the officials are concerned, initially those forums were established by Warren Hastings, and those were intended to subserve litigation between Indians and interpret the Indian laws. Those were all for according to them, the so-called natives. So during that time, it didn't really matter what kind of an infrastructure you had and what kind of lawyers practiced. All the lawyers who were of some significance went to London, came back with degrees and practiced in the Supreme Court or the High Court there. So therefore this divide is age old. We are all obliged to get over this elitism and then go back and then work towards a situation where at every forum that prestige and dignity is maintained. That imbalance must be removed.
Yes, sir, I agree with you on principle, which in fact I have heard from even the olden days, that you must give justice at the place where the cause of action arises. We know that we have a tree panchayat where they go, the occurrence is there. In fact, I remember to have read that in the olden days, before the Manu, everything, when the king was ruling, they were having circuit benches, and then down the line, he will send men to the respective villages. He will go there, hear their grievances and pass an order. Against that, they'll have a right to appeal to the circuit bench, and then they'll come up in appeal to the king. So they used to deliver judgment at the place where the thing has occurred so that nobody can hide the facts which are necessary for delivering a judgment. And each is giving a distorted fact, and nobody knows who is giving the best or who is playing a better liar is what we are determining. We are not actually driving the truth. Sometimes I feel so frustrated, sometimes whether I'm doing the right thing or a wrong, whether I'm fighting for a real cause. I have my own doubts sometimes in this profession. Thank you very much, sir. So nice of you.
This thing occurs to all of us all the time. That's why we are.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Actually, sir, in terms of execution, I find that still Order 21 CPC is more powerful.
Yes.
And it is in the hands of the individual judges to make it implemented properly. And when a decree is passed by the courts of civil jurisdiction, I think it's better than the execution, I think implementation before the High Court. And for the matter of indifference to the orders of the court, the government has got the same indifference. It has got no difference between the High Court or the civil courts. So I just request Mr. Nahamuthu to interact with you. Yes.
Sir, good afternoon, sir. Welcome, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, sir.
Sir, it is really a much awaited lecture, sir, from you. I was in constant touch with Mr. Srinivas Raghavan, how to secure you here. And I am very happy, sir, to hear your lecture. And I thank sir on behalf of all the participants for this
Yes.
wonderful lecture. Thank you, sir. And in fact, and you are a highly reputed and also a very responsible senior advocate in the Supreme Court. I know I got a very great respect for you. And I, in fact, thought of raising only one issue to seek your views on that. But now after having heard Mr. Chitra Sampath, I think that I can add one more thing also. Because I had a practice for about 25 years in this before the subordinate judiciary. And I see Mr. R. Swaminathan, a very reputed senior advocate, and who also practiced along with me in the Mosul Court, sir. Sir, with my experience, and I can also vouch for the experience of Mr. Swaminathan also, I can say that the subordinate judiciary is so as independent as any other court, sir. And therefore, I find it very, very difficult to agree with the view expressed by Mrs. Hemalatha Sampath. Sir, I can tell you, sir, that in several cases relating to Section 80, we have got interim orders, sir. That too, even export interim order from the lowest judiciary, namely district municipal level. It is not as though the subordinate judiciary is not independent, and because they are getting salary, pension, etc. from the government, they have surrendered their independence to the government, and they are afraid of. I tell you, sir, in all criminal cases, mostly the contesting party is the government. It is not as though they are afraid of the government, they are not acquitting, even in sensational matters. And ultimately, though they do not grant any ex parte order because of Section 80, the suit is decided many a times against the government rightly also. It shows that subordinate judiciary is independent. Therefore, as rightly pointed out by Justice Mrs. Vimala also, I joined her. Their subordinate judiciary is very independent, sir, number one. Number two, sir, the actual issue which I wanted to raise to you is this. And having regard to your position in the Supreme Court, your reputation and all that, sir, my question is this. I am very happy that you have touched upon an important topic saying that the subordinate judiciary should be strengthened and their powers should be free to be exercised. I am very happy about that. So far as Tamil Nadu is concerned, sir, with my experience as a lawyer as well as a judge for more than 10 years, sir, our subordinate judiciary in Tamil Nadu has been strengthened further, sir. Number of courts have been established and all the courts are almost filled. There is no vacancy. There is no pendency, sir, virtually in the subordinate judiciary. I can assure you, sir, if a suit is filed today and the first appeal itself will be disposed of within 2 years, I tell you, sir. So maximum time taken for any suit, mostly, is only 2 years. Pendency is in the High Court. In our Madras High Court, you know very well that second appeals from 1980s are still pending. We are struggling. Yes. This is the position of the High Court. Now let us go to the Supreme Court, sir. So I am told that more than 50,000 cases are pending. People are slowly losing their faith in the system because of the pendency. If any matter, if notice is granted, issued, then that is the end of the day. One. And I have seen lawyers requesting the honorable judges not to grant leave at all. They request the court, kindly don't grant the leave, please kindly dispose it off. If leave is granted, you know that it is pending for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. So what is your idea, sir? Much debate is going on. What is your idea, sir, as to how to reduce the pendency, how to reduce the Supreme Court, so to reduce the pendency? So in that context, what is your view about the view of Mr. K.K. Venugopal, the very eminent senior counsel, to have regional appellate courts? What's your view on that, sir? Please.
Sir, Supreme Court's problem, we don't have one single solution, but then let us talk about this. Time management, the number of matters which get filed. We have somewhere lost the distinction between precedent making and decision making.
Correct.
The biggest problem we are facing today.
Yes.
Supreme Court is a precedent making court.
Yes.
But you will agree with me that they sit to decide disputes between the parties every day. That's
Correct.
the biggest problem.
Yes.
If it decides that we will only lay down the principle, two things will happen. They will decide in which cases they should write judgments. and they will decide how those judgments will affect the interpretation of law in all the high courts and the lower courts. The focus will be on law making. But today what's happening, sir? They are not blaming, but they are flooded with cases. So every time they are there, lawyers are arguing, contesting against each other, and then by the end of it, they are bound to write a judgment. And they are actually deciding cases rather than making a precedent. Incidentally, there might be, invariably you will see every case, the Supreme Court will say, we have already held, therefore we hold. This is how it is coming to. So therefore, they must confine themselves to cases which require a decision to be made, and with respect to large number of pending cases which are arising out of appeals at 136, they must quickly decide and not waste time in their decision. It's a discretion, 136 jurisdiction. But then cases go on and on for hours together. I mean, we are to blame, not the judges. Hours together, it goes on. So therefore, it has now gone, we've gone past the stage of management because the number of cases pending are so large.
50,000.
Mechanism. What is the other methodology? This concept of taking judgment writing is also very much time consuming. So there must be a support to the judges. There must be a methodology to that. And every high court order will spill over to the Supreme Court. Now, that is the reason why my thought was that if you reduce large number of cases from out of the kitty of the High Court, perhaps the number of matters that will be carried to Supreme Court will get reduced. There is no one solution. I am not here to suggest all the problems and say one or two suggestions, but there are multiple issues. My thought was one or two on them. So it's not an easy thing, but I can assure you that this is doable. It is not gone beyond the control. Easily doable. If all of them put together, apply their mind, use technology, use the lawyers to assist them, and the process of judgment making and other things, it's easily doable. It's not difficult. It is not at all difficult. And also, where is the responsibility of lawyer also?
Yes. Yes.
You go on and on. We have just thought that this oral arguments is an end in itself.
True.
I was in Hamburg to do an international international case in the Italian Marines case. There were on the bench about 16 judges.
Oh.
And the method of argument is that you complete your pleadings. After you complete your pleadings, you are given a particular time. And in that time, you have to write down your arguments.
Oh.
So write down your arguments in the manner as if you're speaking, not like in our written submission. You have to write down your arguments. And then you read that speech. So the judges exactly will know what your stand is. There's no unexpected. We have got used to this too much of luxury of arguing for hours together and pulling a fast one, not disclosing all arguments at the first place. So this process gave a great amount of what you call ability of argumentation. Gave vent to coming up with some innovation, spring some surprise on the other person. These methods have cropped into our methodology of arguments, which is not the correct method. The correct method is you disclose exactly and you specify, this is my argument. Let other side also come back with what he wants to argue in a small speech. The rest of it, pleadings are anyway there. On the basis of this, what needs to be decided become very, very clear. But if you argue for 4.5 hours or 5 hours, repeat the same point again and again, complete precision is lost. And this thing has to be thought about. Arguments also, there must be a limit to it. Pleadings of Madras, which other states have adopted thereafter, very cryptic, extremely precise. Extremely precise.
Thank you very much, sir, for this ideas.
Thank you, SNG, sir, for your very lively interaction. As Mr. Justice Namuthu said, I support Justice Vimala's view. I think the subordinate judiciary is no way inferior to any of the judges in the Madras High Court. The only issue is they should be empowered, they should be given more authority, and they should be given more freedom so that they will prove what they are up to.
There is no pendency in a subordinate judiciary. That also please kindly reiterate.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. If I file a suit today in a district court, I can judgment within 6 months.
Yes.
And the first appeal may not take more than 1 year.
I wanted to say something.
Yes, sir.
It's what matters is the reputation.
Correct.
Reputation is also created by us. The forum of lawyers is substantial. It is important for us to emphasize the reality of the fact that subordinate judiciary is honest, more than substantially. We don't need to say somebody who is. I mean, that's a human phenomenon. That is very important. Their competence, their ability. You know, the more you say, the more inspiring it becomes. So it is important for all of us to reiterate the truth and reality of the fact. And it will build like anything. It will inspire the judges. It will inspire the institution.
So at the same time, sir, I think the apprehensions expressed by Mrs. Chitra Sampath as to the practical difficulty are also an issue to be addressed either by revamping the system or by seeing that the hassles are removed. And her apprehensions regarding some of the practical difficulty are to be given serious note of this, in my humble opinion. Mr. Karupasamy Pandin from Madurai High Court has asked a question. If judicial review forms part of the basic structure of the Constitution of India, how do we expect the same to be exercised by the civil courts?
If judicial review is basic structure,
Yeah.
then I think civil courts exercising judicial review is the logical extension and the blossoming of the beauty of basic structure.
Beauty of the basic structure, exactly. It's only an extension and an expanse of the administrative law to see that the civil courts are. Am I right, sir?
I think the vision of the constitutional makers will be satisfied.
Sir, this Vimala has raised a question in the text box on whether restatement of law as followed by the American Bar Association will be helpful if it is implemented in India.
That's a very beautiful question. Supreme Court attempted that, but that failed. Because there is a system by which you make a restatement. What is a restatement? If you have a particular section and on the interpretation of the section, there are 16 judgments. Just as a hypothetical case. If you have 16 judgments on that question, everybody will quote all the 16 cases. Everybody who is reading has to read that. So the time has come. They thought that you tell us in as limited words as possible what exactly is the deduction of that section by virtue. So to do away with all that 16 judgments, you cull out the essence of it and formulate it in 1 or 2 or 5 sentences. This is the restatement. Halsbury's laws, I was told, had the original authors, Lord Halsbury, has said that if this book has to be reviewed after the statement is made, no explanation should be given. He said, which means that is what restatement. Why should there be explanation? The statement must be precise, must be simple, and must immediately convey the meaning. That is what restatement is. And I think it's high time. My friend has raised a very good question. High time. In so many laws, so many subjects, we need restatement, and restatement can't be preparation like that of a digest of the Supreme Court cases. You can't do that. In fact, the previous, it was a failure for the reason that the restatement was a digest compilation of all the judgments of the Supreme Court. And restatement must be by authority. You make or I make a restatement, nobody will cite. Restatement has to be made on the ground that in such a manner that of these 6 judgments on the same topic, the restatement is you must make 3 sentences or 4 sentences in which the judge should come, and this must have the approval of the court, and somebody should cite in the court that restatement, and matter ends there. You don't need to cite 101 judgments on that. That is the purpose of restatement. We don't know how to make a restatement, so I think some Chief Justice will take it up and then redo it.
So I think I have an inquisitive question, if you don't mistake me. So whenever the judiciary, especially the higher judiciary, thinks in terms of any reforms or need to revamp the system, existing system, the call or the solution comes from within. I don't find the higher judiciary takes the clue or help or assistance of any external body. And fortunately, we have a statutory body called the Law Commission of India. Unlike the State Law Commission of India is a statutory body. And I don't think the reports of the Law Commission of India are taken serious note or cognizance. For example, you might know well that in 2003, the Law Commission of India has submitted a very comprehensive report on the revamping of the entire framework of Indian Evidence Act. But I'm told that it has gone to the tunnel of the Standing Committee of the Parliament of India. And even after the lapse of nearly 20 or 25 years, it's still lying there. And he's not able to see the end of the tunnel. And what could be the source of a suggestion or something, an external aid to the Supreme Court to see that these kind of suggestions, like what you have now put innovatively, to be taken serious note of, in your opinion?
As you have said, Law Commission is a formal channel. It was intended to work as a formal channel. But then the way decision makers, not just Supreme Court, we are talking about any decision makers, have plurality of views and ideas to come to them in implementation. There is a semblance. I should say that it is not as if they don't take into account anything at all. But there is a system by which formally or informally some information comes to them and then they take a decision. You are talking of a formal methodology, a forum, which consultation takes place, but then perhaps what you're saying is right. It is not to the satisfaction of so many who has different ideas. There must be a repository of ideas.
Exactly.
Somebody would convey an idea and has some assurance that somebody is looking into it.
Yes,
normally in modern executive functioning, at least in Europe and America, before any decision is taken, this process is a very important process where they will have a forum where views are given, their consideration is taken. There is a system which is being developed in very much in detail. We should move towards something like that where there is if you are talking exclusively of judiciary, we are talking of a situation where in the context of judicial reform, there must be a committee and there must be a forum where views are known, people know that he can post his views there. And there must be a communication, let us say, somebody who is a spokesman who will come once in a month and review the suggestions given and specify the steps taken. That gives a sense of satisfaction that to persons who have given a view that, okay, my view has been considered. Whether right or wrong, whether accepted or not accepted is a different matter.
There must be a mechanism. As you said, Law Commission can only be reported to the government. It is for the government to enact a law or not. There is no direct nexus between the Law Commission and the courts. So there must be a mechanism, as I said, a forum to get for the suggestions or feedback of the common man or people who are in the field and convey the to the Supreme Court or the High Court so that they can take note of it and see that whether it can be acted upon or taken into account or something. I think one day or another, we can hope for something good happen to this kind of mechanism. So I should wholeheartedly thank for two things. Number one, unless you suggested the topic, we wouldn't have had the very innovative and original thinking in the what is called the today's deliberation, a thinking which is something very rare and unique. So I should salute the original thinking you have had and the way in which you have deliberated in the short time and the way in which you have interacted with the persons, including judges. Really, the session went very well, sir. So on behalf of my co-host and the participants, sir, I wholeheartedly thank you for the excellent session we had, sir.
Even I enjoyed every bit of it. It is like home seeing all of you.
Thank you, sir.
Enjoyed it.
Kind of you, sir. Thank you.